Brilliant, thank you. The Greater Manchester put out a tender back at the beginning of the year for a willing to pay market intervention, which was pretty much a replica of what Bayes put out in 2018, which I tried to get Retrofit Works into Manchester then. Obviously, Retrofit Works are from down your neck of the woods. Russell Smith's one of the only sort of at scale credible players in the field at the moment. Manchester did have an alleged cooperative, delivery vehicle funded by Bayes, but actually 4 years on, it's delivered less retrofits than Red Co-op has, despite having had really quite a lot of funding. So there's a lesson there. But what we've done is we've put together all the pieces of a systemic, discussing it in 10 days' time at a decarbonisation conference in Manchester. And the basic premise is all the stuff I've been banging on about for 15 years. So some of you will have heard me bang on about other things interminably for ages, and this is the new thing to bang on about, which is that we can actually do this, and the cost of living crisis means we really need to do this. If you look for the BRE's Retrofit Revealed report from 2010, that house scored a third, and the house that scored first was, which one is it? It's this one at the top, 237. Passive start ventilation. Oh no, it's the biomass. Next one down, 241. Passive vent, biomass, solar thermal, and a whole lot of appliances on top of basically a fairly standard spec of fabric insulation, which I'll come on to. So being a one-trick pony, I've just been repeating that and building on it for years. Obviously, as you've probably noticed on the battle over whether they're going to demolish M&S or not down your way, is just that little purple fringe there, bottom of the biscuit tin. Only the whole ones have got any calories in them. Build passive house will have that subsequently, but if it's 50 to 80 tonnes and we've got to be at zero in the next 20 years, then at 4 tonnes average CO2 per property, actually where was the benefit? So the green, as indeed the AJ now says, the greenest building is one that already exists. You'll have probably heard fabric first, but it's important to go, it's not fabric only. So the idea is get all your properties to 50 kilowatt hours per square metre per year. So if you're in a 100 square metre flat, that means you're using 5,000 square metres of heat into your property in a year, but I'll come on to how those numbers break down in a bit. The problem is that each half of emissions you save costs the same as the next half, and so you have this exponential curve as you slide upward. But we can rescue completely buggered properties that other people would have just thought were worth nothing and made them into something quite shishy. So that's taking the walls to quite a much higher U value than is usual, because it enables you to get the overall space heating right down without having to chase teeny tiny things of incremental change around the place, because whilst you've got the scaff up, just put fatter insulation on. It does mean you need to think about the walls and about the roof line and the reveals, but it can work. You can even do reveals around existing windows if you get a bit creative. We've been trying a system for wonky walls, where you stick and rubbish brickwork. I've never tried drilling into a London stock brick, so I don't know how soft your bricks are, but the Mancunian bricks of the turn of the last century are absolute pants. And you try drilling and fixing into them, they frequently shatter, and certainly if you end up with a fixing in a bed joint, you're absolutely knackered. So this way we could see where we're fixing, and then you stuff it full of insulation. Where the property's got good overhanging eaves, there's no extra cost to doing the extra thickness other than the materials, because you've already got a geezer up the scaff doing it. And then we hid all of the drainage behind some removable timber cladding, locally sourced, UK grown. There is a version for cavity walls using polystyrene, but we don't advise it where you need vapor permeability through your masonry. But where you're in a more modern building with failed cavity wall, or with no cavity wall and too small a cavity, this is not a bad solution. It's an awful lot cheaper than the previous page. You've got to try and recreate details, but don't do it slavishly. I heard someone tell me the other day they were going to 3D print the details they were covering with the external wall insulation. I had to get a tad forthright to put them off that one. On this one, they had those 45-degree bricks on the windowsills, so we just planted some clay tiles, suitably waterproof, to recreate the effect. You can neaten up the roofline and make it safer. One of the things that you might have spotted with a lot of retrofit is people think that a bit of mastic and a plastic trim is going to last 35 years, which of course it isn't. This welded stainless steel fabrication made up in Middleton finishes off the insulation nice and neatly, gives you a space butch enough to put a roof ladder into it, so you haven't got some poor roofer dangling about on this in the years to come when they do re-roof this. And it also means that you can put the roofer up against the wall insulation without trashing the gutter. Costs £250 a linear metre, but I think it's worth every penny for the way that it makes the building look so much better, as well as creating better safety for your workforce. We've even had on the internal wall insulation, we've had people wanting roller blinds installed into the wall insulation. This is very much the same technology as on the outside. The only change is that what it gets plastered with has a higher value on the vapor impermeability, so that it's called an SD value, and polythene is like 1,000, and air is 1. Obviously, top up your lofts. The problem with a whole load of the funding streams is that loft insulation is just lobbed in there, and then anyone that comes in afterwards doesn't do it that well. Doing it neatly seems to be a new art, but you have to be careful when you bring your insulation right up to the underside of your slates, because if the sarking that you're ramming that under isn't vapor permeable, you run the risk of condensation. Install some ventilation if you're doing this underneath an asphalt sarking. You need to also make sure that if people are using lofts for storage, you put some loft legs in there with some chipboard on top, because insulation don't work so well when it's got a suitcase on top of it. Room and roof, very popular, either just sorting out the existing, so in this case we just extended the existing rafters to get 200 mm of insulation in, and then you cover that with a vapor membrane, with an intelligent vapor membrane. In this case on the right, the room was so small, we insulated at roof level rather than loft, so that they could get a sleeping deck into the roof pitch. Chimneys, fill them. Don't insulate around them because it's more expensive, but fill them with something that's utterly inert, as green as you can manage it, doesn't allow capillary action, and won't tolerate mould. Left is recycled glass beads, right is vermiculite. Not so sure about vermiculite yet, but it was cheap and available, and we'd run out of the stuff on the left. But I'm going to give it a try because there's a much more developed supply chain for that. We've even done really, really funky wall insulation last year. The customer wanted a recreation of the original details, but wanted to be a lot warmer. So this takes her original 1905 wall to modern building regs, but I learned how to make a curved skirting. My mate John remade the curved cornice at the top, and we had somebody make us some curved plasterboard to wrap around the insulation, and then we also lined the windows out with a bit of insulation first and then some wood to remount the architraves on, so that it looked like we were never there, except it's a lot neater than it was without the damp patches. We've also been trying out insulation that you just stick straight onto the wall. That isn't opposed to that photograph. It looks like I set it up for her. That when you strip the plaster first and put a clay powder coat on, for enthusiasts amongst you, that's a lot of fun, because clay is utterly inert. You've got to work really hard to damage your health with it. It doesn't actually set, it just dries. So if you balls it up, you just spray it with a plant sprayer and have another go, and you can get a perfect finish with it. You can keep doing it until you get it right, and then call yourself a plasterer. Just about. But what it does is it buffers moisture that makes its way through the wood fibre and stops it getting caught in the middle of the wall and allows it to carry out to the outside of the building. Curved bays, they're a lot of laughs, but they need doing. We had the windows made by Green Building Store, where they trimmed a chamfer off each of the panes so that we didn't have quite so much wood in the way. Anyone that's ever seen UPVC reglazed bay windows notices just how terrible they look, because there's hardly any window left over. And also, by having inward openers where you can do tilt and turn, we could get rid of the little fan light at the top and so get more light back in. We've also been designing, we've designed it, we're trying to get certification on a wall insulation system developed between me and a supplier down in Devon that works better for a lower skill set, because we don't have enough skilled trades to do all the retrofits we need. At the time I had 12 theatre workers wanting some work, so I devised this to be able to work with the skill set they'd had from set building, basically using an insulated stud, and rather than a special technical plaster to finish with, just a vapor control layer, and then you cap that off with plasterboard and skim, which means you keep your skilled trades right to the end and keep the costs down. And it'll wrap around corners just about. You have to make sure that you carry the insulation across the floor. Obviously, where the joists go into that wall, you've got to make sure that you make that thoroughly airtight. Squirty foam is allowable when you're up against a lath and plaster ceiling, because what else can you do? And then you carry the insulation down past the DPC. Don't let anyone tell you you can't, because that then means that if you've got a solid concrete floor, you don't need to insulate the floor. You're insulating it from the outside by stopping the insulation getting in. Otherwise, you're going under the floor. You've got Q-bot down your way. Not absolutely fond of spraying foam onto the underside of a floor if you don't know what the moisture's doing. And obviously, in Manchester, we've got quite a lot of water, and it gets all over the place. So much so that in some cases, we've had to, I'll come back to that one. So this is our latest ideal spec, a fetching shade of purple. It's basically a really, really gloopy paint that fills in all the gaps between the floorboards and makes sure that you are airtight at the floor level, and therefore also acts as a vapor control layer, and then you insulate beneath it and put a mesh on that just to hold it in place until they save up the money to put a ceiling in. We've been trying recycled glass pumice, used it 11 years ago. It's not gone wrong yet, touch wood, but we've got some moisture sensors in to get some actual scientific data so we can feel like we might be able to get it insured to put under people's floors, because as I said, we used it a while ago. The nice thing about it is it's utterly inert. It's using a waste product because there's way more glass way more recycled glass on the planet than uses for it. And and we've even developed a tool for taking up floors seamlessly. But in some cases there's so much water that's actually a puddle. So we put a field drain underneath this floor and then the recycled glass pumice. We said we can't guarantee this because we can't, but your floor was rotting before we did this. It shouldn't be a problem from here, and so far it hasn't been. But there's a difficult issue about insurance in these cases. So I've only done it on a small number of cases where I've said if there's a problem I'll come and take it out later, which is obviously not something I can roll out at scale, which is a bit of a shame. But the manufacturers of this won't pony up any cash to get it certified, which is a bit of a blow. We've even done an underfloor. We've even done a floor replacement with no concrete. So that one is the recycled glass pumice, thoroughly tamped and then finished with a interlocking basalt block that's just fused together, and then with the underfloor heating pipes laid into it. Windows, obviously, this is an ancient slide, but it's still the best way to do it. Secondary glazier feature stained glass, replace the casements but with triple glazed units in them, strip out the original sashes, clean them up, refurbish them, top up the sash weight so that you can put a double glazed unit in the old opening bit, and then change the beads for ones with draft seals on them. We call this a Manchester window in Manchester. They call it a Sheffield window in Sheffield. Lord knows what you call it down there. But it's the sloping window that you get on terraced housing of the 19th century that brings a bit of extra light in. Almost always leaks. We've devised a method of stopping that. You'll notice that we're putting the windows into the insulation for better thermal performance, but also to reduce the tunnel effect of wall insulation, so you get a nice grand windowsill instead of a tunnel from your window outward, which people like more, although an inward opening window means you do need to be a bit careful. There's the before and after on the windows. We've also devised a replacement a removable window reveal with an extra step in it, because they didn't want to replace the plastic windows at this stage, but the plastic windows are in the wrong place thermally, so this step in the woodwork here is so they can take that out and burn it later or whatever, and put the new window in there, and this whole reveal will pop out without having to redecorate the entire wall. Use the opportunity to make it better. Don't just put the same old thing back because it's a bit pants. Insulate around the windows. You've got to make sure your reveals don't have a cold bridge around them, which depends on the shape of the brickwork. That previous slide, there was the old recess for the sashes. This was an old weaver's cottage, just solid wall, no step. So we rebaited a bit out the back of it to get some expensive insulation in there to stop the condensation, because you get quite a lot of thermal losses around the junctions between things on the left, and also drafts around things. So that's under the door, and that's some gaps around in the cellar. There's the windows being fitted on the outside and fully taped and everything next to the insulation. There's hide your soil stack if you can. So basically don't carry the pipe all the way to the top, just hide an air admittance valve underneath this slot, and then you can hide it all under a nice fetching piece of larch. Make sure you ventilate though. We're looking at electric systems these days because passive stacks are a bit unreliable and occasionally drafty, but you can put your ducting in the chimneys where there are some, and then top it all off with as much PV as you can get on the roof and a battery. They now work. If you can afford it, put a ground source heat pump in. They are by far and away the most useful in terms of being able to use energy when it's cheap overnight. Air source heat pumps require air, work better when the air's a bit warmer, so you tend to use them during the day. The picture on the right there is something that Ventive have developed for Energisprong initially, but they're now hoping to roll it out, which is an exhaust air source heat pump. So it will deal with your ventilation and your heating and hot water all in the same piece of kit, which is then 600 square but 7 foot high. And don't do that. If you can't afford to change the windows and they're in the way, then actually wait till you can replace the windows, because that's just embarrassing, frankly. You've got an enormous thermal bridge down this edge to the window, and then they've had to leave a little insulation equivalent of a snow angel there so they can still get the ventilation in. And this as well, they've stopped the insulation at ground level, just to make sure that in this case you get a bit of condensation along the floor edge. They've stopped it at the top of the lead flashing over the bay, so you've got another cold bridge there. But then just to try and show that they were being nice about it, they've put a strange little soldier course in here, just scored into the pretend brick render on the top. Don't do that, do this. So in this case, that's extruded polystyrene because it doesn't absorb water, won't transmit it, stuck below the DPC, and then just covered with Marley Modern tiles, and then that's the rendered top. And people want other stuff doing while you're there, so let's do the other stuff while we're there. Loft conversions, I'm on my third one of those now, so that you get that kind of effect. You can do things with off-site. It's very popular, very trendy, but off-site construction. So if you want to put a dormer in and you don't want your roof off overnight because it's going to chuck it down, which it did despite that blue sky behind it, then we built this in a works up in Salford, CNC cut the plywood to the shapes, and then, where there were any, and then glued it all up with the insulation in so we could drop the whole thing in on site in a day. and then it's got a bit more insulation on the outside and then some more larch. This one we actually did a whole floor, lost a small fortune on it, but it was worth the punt. Her loft floor had been, well, it was basically the ceiling with plasterboard on 3x2 joists, so it was all sagging. The engineer had condemned it. She was being rained on with bits of falling plaster as the ceiling died. So we put a new floor in beneath it so that we could then get better ceiling height in the loft, and then it meant that when we came to take down the ceiling, we didn't fill the whole house with 120-year-old soot, dust and all the other stuff, and it made it a lot tidier. And then we even reused the purlin we took out for the dormer to hold up the floor edge. And so those cassettes all went in, they've got the insulation in them. The bit that did work really well was prefabricating the little bit of wall that goes between curved bay windows so that we could take the bay off and have it secure again at the end of one day. So we didn't have to do all that boarding up and hope no one broke in and nicked all our stuff. And we even tried some steam bending of some larch to refurbish the old cornice on top of the new windows. And there's me making some curved skirtings. You can get the details for that still. We set this up 7 years ago, but it's still current because insulation still does what it does, so does water and heat. So though Retrofit does support, we're hoping to try and develop that to make it part of the service. And here's how the numbers work. You basically, this is the regulated version, I'll skip that one because this is the more fun one. You basically do a bit of energy efficient appliances to reduce, and a bit of behaviour change to reduce the unregulated parts that you need in your house, you then have your space heating and your hot water down as low as you could get them because you've done a proper insulation job on the house. That gives you 7 megawatts of heat, but if you put a heat pump in with a coefficient of performance of 4 for the heating and 3 for the hot water, you drop your total energy down to 4.2 megawatts, which you can generate off 5 kilowatts of PV off the roof. You then end up with a zero carbon house without having to knock it down. You could just do it in an existing home for about 55 grand. In fact, here is one I prepared earlier. This is a little terrace in Rugeley, where the landlord had already done some insulation, but I've repriced it into this just to make it equivalent. So because that's an old wimpy no fines, we can use the cheaper insulation on it. And then there's all of the other bits that gets you to that, and you pay for that by saying, right, well, so this year's this energy bill coming will be 1,970 quid. The new bill post retrofit 360, that's on the new tariffs. So you can put that 1,610 quid towards your cost recovery and then sell some extra energy on top of that because your battery's done collectively with 599 other people, and that then it comes to the same number as your loan repayments. You could either do that with a mortgage extension plus any sort of something that the public sector might have available for you, or you get the public sector to do all of the borrowing for you so that you can reduce the cost of the borrowing down to sort of 2.5%. That's how it works. I could carry on. Shall we carry on? So here's how the numbers work roughly. This is last year's numbers. I haven't redrawn these graphs for this year's yet. Basically, there's the cost of your retrofit heading towards zero. Don't quote me on those numbers. It's just to give you a rough idea, but 90,000 for a passive house zero carbon retrofit isn't far off the mark. And therefore impractical in my view. And as you can see, you can have 90% savings for an awful lot less and then save the rest of your carbon in other ways. How you pay for that then depends on the cost of your finance. So actually we haven't had PWLB at 1.6% for a while, nor have we had mortgages at 2.9. That's up at 2.2 and 3.4 now, but you get the picture that if your borrowing's cheaper, then those annual costs of cost recovery on that retrofit become lower. The problem is that obviously your savings are linear. So you have a sweet spot where you cover where the cost of your occupation, the total cost of occupation of the property, overtakes what it was previously. You can stick some PV and battery on top of that, which will help a bit, but most of it will go back into the cost recovery of the PV and the battery last year. So your sweet spot moves a little bit further north. So you slide a little bit further up that cost recovery, that emissions reduction graph. But the big one is you then sell your energy collectively currently out into the national grid, but in a couple of years' time it'll be onto the energy markets as well, so that your sweet spot gets you to pretty close to zero. And by the time you've counted all the carbon of your PV and the fact that your batteries are displacing gas turbines when you're discharging them, it all starts to become, you get to zero basically. Retrofit's still too pricey, but it's probably one of the only places I agree with the state. Bayes thinks we should reduce the cost of retrofit by half over 10 years. So if we did that on that kind of curve where we're saving on everything, and then we tried borrowing money in each year with a mortgage, you'll see that therefore eventually we break even if the cost of finance is cheap enough in 7 years' time. Now, obviously, Vladimir messing around in Ukraine plus a whole load of completely unrestrained capitalism means that we've ended up with all of those graphs going completely different, and actually it's feasible this year, bizarrely, uncomfortably. Obviously, that doesn't deal with those people in abject fuel poverty, so these graphs still remain useful because we ought to be getting people back to a cost of occupation that they could nearly afford. And in fact, up until even in March, 13% of the country couldn't afford its energy bills then. So we need to start slowly so we can get this better, get those cost savings in by getting better at it, and then go mass. But if we do our PV and battery up front, then we can actually get to a point where our carbon reduction curve stays a little bit nearer the budget. Manchester is 9.7 million tonnes away from its budget, and it's only 4 years into its budgets on its CO2. I think if we do this collectively and we lend across the piece to everyone and we do clever things with the finance, we could actually remove fuel poverty in a decade. We do it by going out to crowdfunding and communities first, partially just to get community engagement, but frankly also to make sure that we set up a vehicle that's community controlled, so that if people put the money in, they become the controlling membership. But obviously there's a limit to the amount of money that's going to yield. And even if we went out to the public sector where they do still have borrowing capacity, given the restrictions on PWLB, that's still a little difficult. So you're going to end up going to the private sector eventually, but you can make sure that the community and then the public sector are in control first before you let the people with the wide braces and the Marie Chandon have it through the door. But obviously they carry the lion's share of the funding over time. But you make sure that you've got the controls in place. This is not easy. And so since we were appointed at the end of March, and I would really love some more sleep. We've got all 10 of those components to get up and running. Some of those we're doing locally, some of which are the red. I'm hoping other components get dealt with by other parts of the country, and maybe we'll create a community of interest across the country that delivers on some of these. But our offer in Manchester is that we're going to take that customer journey and all of those parts of it, and we've assembled a whole load of people, some of them local, creative concern doing the communications, but we've got Parity Projects from that, they're London, doing some of the assessments. We've brought in Qbot, not because we want to spray the foam under the floor, but because they've got a really interesting retrofit management system, and Tom Lipinski's quite sharp. And then we've got Shap from the West Midlands helping out. The pattern book I showed you earlier. Retrofit Works is going to be the prime part of the delivery, which started off in London, but now has programmes in Oxfordshire and now Manchester. It did have one in West Sussex, but they couldn't get it to work. Flexelectricity is our virtual power plant provider, etc. You'll see the point. It's a collective effort. The principle being that whilst those costs of retrofit are way higher than most people think are credible and have done for years, actually when they did some market engagement work in Greater Manchester last year, they found that 3.3% of the population did want a deep retrofit and they wanted it now, which is alarmingly close to Roger's adoption curve of the 70s or 60s or whenever, which said you'd have 2.5% innovators and then 13.5% early adopters. So our argument is, let's normalise retrofit among those people that get it, and then everyone else will follow suit afterwards. Obviously, zero carbon means many things to many people. We're aiming at number 4 because we can and we should, because fuel prices are still going bonkers. Getting people off the fuel price escalator seems like a good thing. But if we can't reach that, if we can't get to that just because the money won't go there, then we can step down those lines of offer. The nice thing about retrofit is you can do all these other things with it as well. Obviously reduce carbon, but you can get people out of fuel poverty. You can make sure they don't die in their home from mould or damp or cold, and obviously make everyone comfier and therefore less depressed. Obviously within the context of global societal collapse and the rest of it, but you know what I mean. The offer is therefore relatively simple. Don't necessarily do everything at once, but do if you can. But make sure that when people do measures, they're no regrets measures, so you can build up over time. We're working with Parity on making the assessments more accurate but cheaper to do. That's an uphill struggle, but we're trying to basically reduce people's space heating demand on average by about 3/4. We're talking to companies about monitoring this so that we'll know when it works, but therefore by equal measure know when it doesn't. I've got another funding bid into Innovate UK to try and join all the software up so that that works, so that we can get that to team up with the patent book that I've already mentioned. But the big one, the interesting one, is the additional revenues from battery storage. If we take all of that money, all of that energy when it's generated, store it until until it's needed on a daily basis. You'll notice that's a really old slide because that's still got coal in it. I probably need to update that. And there's potentially quite a lot of money in there. We're currently estimating about 400 quid of additional revenues through the balancing mechanism, which is what the National Grid puts out there. It's actually, for those of you that want to study how libertarianism meets neoliberalism, meets a desperate mission critical need to keep the lights on, actually the National Grid's reserve services are an interesting essay in how it works. It's very interesting. The finance vehicle is another bit that I think is really interesting, that if we can create a capitalised loan fund from the public sector and the community sector as the lead, so that it's able to then lend on a triple bottom line rather than just profit, then we can start to create a gateway. That means we can ensure quality control, but also therefore create a spectrum of different lending propositions. So if you're rich enough to have disposable income that you can help save the planet with, buy some retrofit bonds from that earlier part of the graph, at least take up our loans for the works if you're going to borrow, so that if we can get a cheap enough cost of borrowing in there, then we can use that, we can put a slight margin on that, still stay below the high street rates, but therefore still have something that we can put a little bit of a surplus away to then help fund those unsecured loans and loans at the cost of finance for those in greater levels of poverty, looking at fixed loans with a charge registered with the land registry, or even an equity loan, although they take an awful lot more paperwork. And maybe even one where you don't charge people anything at all until they sell the property. Obviously you can't do many of those because the cost of your finance is substantial, but if you can save up from the ones at the top, it's basically redistributive. It's a redistributive bank. But we've teamed up with a little company from the southwest called Lendology who will do the lending for us. All we've got to do is find the money. When I say all we've got to do, you try finding 50 million quid that someone's not doing much with. The other nice thing about that lending proposition is we might even be able to start to get into landlords. I would really like to creep up on private landlords, so that if we can lend equity lending to them so that we've got a share in the property, we put a progressive letting agency alongside that lets on the basis of the total cost of occupation, and we can add on other services so that you don't get to let the property through this agency unless you're any cop at it. And then for those smaller micro landlords that are doing this but maybe don't really want to, then you head back towards that familiar territory that loads of you have got the scars on your back from short life. You could actually create some letting agents, some cooperative letting in there that would, and then when they've had enough, or you make sure you get first dibs on the property when they come to sell it, then we can start to bring a whole load of the council stock back into something useful. We've obviously got to scale this up, and that's what we've been employed in Manchester to do. We've tendered for the first 200,000. We've said if you can give us another 200, which they've bid for, we could go even further. But actually, if we could bring a whole load of money together, then we can scale up. But that additional money has to be on the jobs. I don't know what it's like down your way. Anyone tried to get a tradesman recently? But anyone that's any good is working flat out. There's 100% employment in skilled construction at the moment. The only people left I've got something going on that's making it a bit wrong. It's really, really, really frustrating. And then the people you can get are then charging £200, £250 a day up here now. It's probably even more down your neck of the woods. And even the Construction Leadership Council agrees with us. So we've basically got quite a lot to do. But the biggest offer of this is that we don't have enough construction people to do the work that is already on the books, never mind introducing a national retrofit programme. So this is the option. I heard one of your number before talk about proper unionised workforce. We could do that here. We could actually get proper working conditions, proper pay, so that we can then get rid of toxic masculinity out of this particular wing of the construction industry, at least, so that we can then get more people in it that run away from that kind of WASP behaviour, and we can actually make this work, because we kind of need to, really. Charlie at Red.co-op if you need to get hold of me.
Charlie, thanks for that, Charlie. Do you want to add anything else, or can I open up for questions?
Oh, please, I could go on, mate. I just better.
Well, we've plenty of time if you want to go on. If does anybody want to ask a question, an intermediate
nice to know in
question?
an ever-changing world, Charlie stayed the same.
Well, I like to
Can you have your hand up? On mute, please, Mick.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was a really good presentation. And, you know, my name's Mick Gilgun, Finsbury Park Housing Co-op, the same as the chair. You know, we're in a small housing co-op and we have got quite sufficient funds. You know, we're not financially, we're financially sound, basically. Now, I have mentioned like retrofitting to the co-op. I do raise it as an issue that we should do when our homes become void, which is very seldom because we're just a small housing co-op. But we've got one presently at the moment, which is a void, that we insulate our homes properly. And this goes along with cyclical as well. When there's a chance to insulate our homes, retrofit, we should be doing so. We've got the finances to do it. But to be honest with you, it's like falling on deaf ears, really. And I mean, it'd be great for you to come along to invite you to the housing co-op for a presentation. But I'm not too sure if it'll be, you know, they need convincing that it's worth pursuing. And also some of the tenants, if it was during cyclical, you know, the occupied places, it's very hard to persuade them to well, it's not hard. You know, people want their bills to be affected. But how do we win the arguments for a start in a small housing co-op? I mean, our housing co-op's like a little island in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, we do need sort of linking up on these issues. I'm also just to sort of say, I'm interested in what you mentioned about crowdfunding. So how we can crowdfund on struggling co-ops. How would this be the case? And also linking up with local authorities for grants. Maybe you could explain something about that. Thanks.
Well, I think I'll go back to this, Mick, just to answer your question, because realistically, that's without the October price readjustment. So that 1,970 quid is the new price cap. Now, obviously, Rishi's opened up his wallet and he's going to give everyone 400 quid back off that, but that's still going to get overtaken by the 800 quid that lands in October that Ofgem confirmed last week. So the really simple offer back to your tenants is, can you afford to pay your current utility bills? Yes or no. Would you like them to be cheaper? Yes or no. And if they want to actually reduce their bills, this is the clearest way to do that. You don't need to do all of the work all at once. So we're going to break cover in Greater Manchester with the PV and battery offer first off, because we need to get over 600 installs to be able to trade into the balancing mechanism. So we want volume, but also we came to the conclusion it's the thing we can do quickest to do something about fuel poverty. Sadly, the local public sector hasn't recognised the value of this and helped us out with some lending back to those houses that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. So we are just going to be able to testing this out on those that already have 15 grand they can get their paws on, which is regrettable, but we'll still get to prove the point. And so if you've got money, then these are the things to do, because at the moment, with energy at 40p a kilowatt hour, every single kilowatt you save is quite notable, and most retrofit measures now pay for themselves. In March, external wall insulation was still a difficult ask to make financially viable. You were looking at 35-year paybacks on very low interest rates, and so I used to conceal it in among the more profitable fruit of the rest of the retrofits, because obviously we also need to reduce our carbon emissions. But as you'll see from the graphs, the key point to point out to you as the landlord is that you can get that to a point where you're no worse off. You would want to exchange some of the utility bill with a rise in service charge, or if you're doing a relet, just change the rent, but you'd make sure that you gave the occupant quite a lot of that money back again. So the conversations I've been having in Birmingham with Castle Vale is they're going to keep the 500 quid from the energy sales, but they're going to let the occupant keep the 1,610 quid of bill savings on the basis that then replaces the universal credit uplift that they got taken off them. And so they get all their tenants better off, who are therefore more likely to pay their rent. So they're prepared to put that in as an investment. So if you've got the cash to do that, crack on.
Just to come in here, Charlie, I was going to raise this as a question, but you partially answered it. What do you think of partially financing it through the increases in service charges, rents, so that effectively people are on universal credit, they're not necessarily, they can actually claim benefits for some of this cost of insulation, rather than at the moment where they have to pay it out of their net income.
I'm still waiting for a legal opinion that is authoritative on to what extent you're able to do that around current regulations in rent. So obviously, you're down your neck of the woods. I suspect you're miles away as cooperators from the rent cap. So maybe you can do that. But up here, it's a lot more difficult to do so. I've been mentioning this to landlords since 2007,
Mm.
and they still haven't done it. Um, your housing, merger of many other previously well-named ones, they are going to try it this year, they tell me. But for God's sake, it's taken 15 years to get here. I think it seems to me to be a no-brainer. If you look at the total cost of occupation of a property, where you're paying, for the sake of argument, £2,000. What's the average rent of your properties in London? £100 a week?
It'd be more. It'd be about 120 for a one bed, I think, and
Right.
sometimes 140 for a two
If we
bed.
said, so we said your rent is £6,000 a year,
Yeah.
and your utility bills are now £2,000, just to round up the 1970. Then that's £8,000 total cost of occupation. If you said to somebody, we'll reduce it to 7.5, that feels to me like still a benefit. You're still making them £10 a week better off. You could even split the difference if you can afford it. Obviously, if you are sat on substantial major repairs sinking funds and you can farm some of it into that, then that would be, well, that would be more progressive, I guess, but only if you can afford it. And obviously, at the end of the day, having cooperative housing that functions is the most progressive outcome. Just depends how much money you've got.
Thanks for that, Charlie. Before I open up other questions, just a comment. In London, a lot of our co-ops are sitting on vast cash reserves. And they are, this year, they will go down in real terms in value by about 10%, because we are not getting anything like the return on our cash reserves. Much better to spend it on schemes like this. You don't have to do every house than it is to hoard the money for some unforeseen rainy day. I'll open up to Mike Roberts. You want a question?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. It's I know we'll be getting the profile, which will be very useful, because when I discuss issues of retrofitting with my key officers at my local authority, it says yes, but nothing comes forward. There are different. Obviously, we've got late 19th, early 20th century properties, and about a third of those cannot be retrofitted. Properties in 1930s, because of cutbacks in construction materials, and also in the 60s, again, have got great difficulties as well about retrofitting. And also, there's now a great push for passive house, etc. So we don't have any data with regard to condition of properties, which I think is a problem that probably all local authorities have got. What is the condition of the properties? And many of the new properties are actually not built to last. So you've got all this pressure for 2030, and you haven't got the skilled labour, you haven't got the investment. So how do we square the circle?
Well, I want to go back to a couple of bits in that. Firstly, as I said in my piece, I don't think the passive house. What's really good about passive house is it ensures quality, because of the amount of checks and balances in it. So I wouldn't at any point resist the need to do that, so that you make sure that what you've said in the calculations gets delivered on site. The bit where I depart from the NFIT standard, which is the retrofit standard from passive house, is their air tightness requirements. Because to get to their air tightness requirements, you pretty much have to take the house apart, and you spend an enormous amount of money that actually, once you've got a heat pump on the go and you've got PV on your roof generating the energy to power it across the year, there is just no point in chasing that last bit of air tightness. And so I would, it's useful in Germany, because it's so cold in winter that if you do get air losses, that needle prick of air at -8 is you're really going to notice it. But I mean, Manchester dropped below freezing for one night last year, and only 2 nights the year before. We don't need that level of performance. So I think it is. If you say to passive house, well, what is it that we're gaining that we wouldn't gain from a slightly lower standard? So the standard I'm espousing is somewhere near the AECB's silver standard, as it used to be. It is now, I think, their carbon light standard. They've changed the name recently, and I've not kept up. So you're still doing best practice. You're still going to hit zero carbon, or you still can. And actually, you can hit it more efficiently. What is the point in doing one passive house retrofit at £100,000, saving 4 tonnes, when you could do 2 at £50,000 each, and so save 8 tonnes? It's a very, very simple piece of maths. In the can't be retrofitted, I haven't met a building I can't retrofit yet. I think there are too many. There's too much received wisdom just being handed down without question. Partially because we lack expertise in the country. There are too few people actually know their way around retrofit well enough to speak authoritatively on this. There are too many people sitting in silos. So you've got somebody in a building technology wing or in a building maintenance wing going, oh yes, it'll cost way too much money to refurbish this, we best knock it down, without actually twigging that the price of knocking it down and replacing it is actually less, and certainly in carbon terms an awful lot less, as I showed earlier, of actually refurbishing the building. And you'd have allies even in the Architects Journal. So there are even there are architects networks now that are actually espousing this. So you'd be able to find support there, and should be able to find some people to give you a hand. If you've got some examples of a property somebody says they can't retrofit, I'd willingly drop you a little explanation of how you could. If you've got some plans and some pictures, that's the sort of thing I really do like, winning a nice argument.
Cheers. Thanks, Martin. Greg?
Thanks, Charlie. You've answered one of the questions that was really preying on my mind a bit, about how a co-op manages to, about balancing the argument between spending co-op money and the individual person getting a saving. I think you're saying that essentially that you would ask for volunteers to have a retrofit where the co-op would then pay their energy bills and they would pay a bit more rent. And that between those, there'll be sufficient to pay it off. But as you clearly thought about it, were there any other models you'd thought about that could be another way of cracking that particular nut?
Well, as I said, the models that I've been exploring, obviously a non-qualifying service charge gets you around your benefit cap problems. A rental increase at relet is obviously an easy one, but only when you relet, and obviously co-ops have very low turnovers because you're cheap and no one's going to move out because they'll prefer to die there. I know this because Homes for Change's turnover is staggeringly low as well. But I think this battery storage income one is definitely one where if you've and in fact on HMOs you can put the PV on the roof, so that you could even start to keep some of the revenues from the PV from other parts of it. It would need modelling, but what you in your battery, you've got the option to generate during the day. You've got multiple ways of making the money work on the battery. So you've got obviously your demand shifting, so you're generating during the day, you're using it at night. But actually, if you've got a 10 kilowatt hour battery and you've charged it up, this is per household, and you've charged it up during the day, you've got 10 kilowatt hours in it, you actually only need 5 to get through the evening, because hopefully by this point you've got an air source heat pump with a hot water cylinder rather than a power shower at 6 kilowatts that you then spend half an hour in and use all your juice on. So you can sell the other 5 kilowatts of that energy. Now that bit that you're selling, then you could actually sell through Octopus's outgoing this week. You don't even need to federate to do that. In 2 years' time, when P415 comes through from Elexon, you'll actually be able to collectively join the energy trading markets, and you would then be able to sell energy at even more money back into the market at that point. So there are multiple ways of generating that income. There's also opportunities to then charge the battery if you've got a time of day tariff. You could charge the battery from half midnight through to 4:30, get it charged. Again, you'll have more in your battery than you need for the following day, especially if you've got an algorithm that's factoring in the following day's weather, the following day's energy prices, because they are published day ahead, as well as intraday trading. And those people are already developing those algorithms. You can generate funding, you can generate revenues that way. So there are ways of collectively generating revenues if you didn't want to pass all of the cost redemption onto the tenant. It is easier to pass it on to the tenant if you're in a bunch of houses spread across the place. But if you're in a housing block, then there are obviously other options you can look at.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Charlie. I'm just going to come in with another question or two, just a preliminary one about London, just a comment on London and the revenues there. Most co-op rents are below social housing rent for London, and you're permitted to increase your rents by rate of inflation for 1% per annum, which is another way of raising the finance to do the retrofit. And I just wanted to know your comments, your opinions, Charlie, on doing the retrofit as part of cyclical maintenance, because this is one way of bringing costs down. And also, you mentioned something about a virtual power network last year.
Yes.
I just wondered if you could give a little
well, the virtual power plant
about that.
The virtual power plant is the means by which you generate the revenues off your battery. So Flextricity is our virtual power plant provider. We're currently just trying to identify software providers. So what you've got, co-op, can generate the revenues. It will receive a CSV file every month with all of the transactions done against those batteries on their IDs, CSV file into payments back to the members of that battery co-op. Some of the software is a bit iffy currently, and Octopus have bought one of the preferred software providers and then are only going to provide the service if you change the supplier. What I'm trying to do is create a model that doesn't require people to change energy supplier. But there is also this other option. I didn't know this until 2 months ago, that apparently you can, if you've got a battery, you can buy your energy off company A and actually sell your energy to company B.
Wow.
So whilst you can't have an Octopus Go tariff for your incoming power and then sell back to Octopus on their Agile outgoing tariff, which is quite lucrative, they've nobbled that by making sure that you have to be on their Agile tariff both ways and their Agile incoming tariff, which I was using for my heat pump up until last year. You've got to be on the two, and the Agile incoming tariff is a tad broken. However, if you can get EDF or E.ON or one of that lot to let you onto their time of day tariff, or if you've already got an economy 7 meter, get on that, and your battery can be charged off your economy 7 meter, then you can still sell your surplus energy in that battery back into Octopus. But obviously you would need to join, I haven't bothered researching that one because what I want to do is get this battery co-op working, but you'd still need some kind of clever algorithm controlling when your battery's sold. But there are companies out there doing it. So my heat pump was controlled by an algorithm specific to my energy use that sold energy, that turned my heat pump off when the power was pricey and turned it back on when the power was cheap. And occasionally I even got paid to charge my battery, charge my heat store. But those days are gone, thanks to Vladimir.
Pity. So anybody got any more questions for
Martin?
Oh, there's two.
Sorry, Martin.
Martin's had his hand up for ages.
No, it wasn't really a question. Thanks for taking me right back in time, Charlie, to the early days of CCH. Glad to see you haven't changed one bit. The other thing to say is just as an advert, really. CCH is going to cover this, aren't they, in their next conference? I don't know if you involved or, but I think they're doing a big thing on this. So at the last meeting I was at, when I vaguely remember paying attention, they were saying this is going to be a big conference theme. So if people are interested in following it up, might be worth trying to send somebody up there if you can afford it to the next conference.
Well, I'll wait for Nick to or Jane to ring me up the day before and say our speaker's dropped out. Can you cover it? That's what they did last year. But
well, it won't be Nick anyway.
Oh,
why has he left?
Oh yes.
Oh,
There's a big story. I won't go in now.
I think they asked Carbon Co-op to cover it last year.
I can check actually, because as I say, I'm not part of the conference thing, and they were saying it, but I'll be interested to know who they're lining up, and if it's not you, then I think we should do a bit of pressuring.
Well, the mayor's
Kathleen and Jenny waiting to come in and ask questions. Sorry, Martin, have you any more questions?
No, that was it.
Yeah. Kathleen, if you're on mute.
Sure. Jenny, do you want to go first? You had your hand up.
Oh, okay. It's just really, we're in a co-op that's in a conservation area, so we can't do external retrofitting. We have very small properties, a lot of them, so people are not keen to have have internal space taken up. But we do have some opportunities to do bits and pieces. But I wondered if is there such a thing as kind of like a checklist of all the retrofitting areas and what can be done in particular areas. because I kind of think it would also, the question people were talking about before, about some co-op members getting a bit antsy about some people getting money off their bills through solar, whatever, and others not. If we actually had a program that said, look, these are the different areas we're going to look at, and your house may fit into one of these areas. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I just want to dispel a couple of misconceptions first. Just because you're in a conservation area doesn't mean you can't do external insulation. So these houses are in a conservation area, and that's the gable. So we internally insulated the front, but externally insulated the gable, and got planning permission for that without a problem. And I've done that twice. A conservation area in Salford as well. So it obviously wasn't just a Mancunian thing. I think on the loss of internal space, I think that should be resisted, because it's not actually. It really doesn't happen. Because I haven't got a picture of my daughter's place, but we tested out this insulation system on her house. And her house is the tiniest house I've ever been in. It doesn't even meet minimum space standards for a single bedder, and it's a 2-bed terrace. And we took 120 mils. She genuinely didn't notice. So I think that those two things are an important first thing. There isn't really a checklist. I mean, there are plenty of checklists around, but I would start from that position that you can insulate the property properly, and then obviously you do the windows while you're there, which you can kind of just about factor into your major repairs provision. Whether they fit into cyclical is moot, but obviously
we've done windows actually, Charlie. So all the windows are double glazed, so we've done that. But
oh, that was so last century, Jenny. It's triples now. Triples are where it's at. But as an interesting one, I did the carbon footprint test for somebody the other day. It doesn't work on windows, but it does work on a boiler. That somebody said, well, I can't take my boiler out because I've still got 5 years left on the warranty. And I said, well, actually, and what about the carbon footprint? And I worked out that the embodied carbon of her gas boiler would have covered itself in the first 13 months of her retrofit. So there are other things that you can do even if you have done them. So back to your question, Jenny, I would counsel that you have a look at internal wall insulation, because I will be very surprised actually if people do notice it's gone. It's not that much loss of space. And then I would also ask your local development control officer whether you would be able to do external wall insulation on those parts of the property not visible from the street, because that's usually the defining prospect of a conservation area, unless it's listed. If it's listed, obviously that's different, but you shake your head. But I have not bumped into any conservation officer that will not let me do external wall insulation to the rear of a property.
We have to pay £250 even to talk to a conservation area officer these days.
Could be worth it. And maybe that's the sort of thing that the London Fed ought to look at collectively doing. I mean,
yes,
realistically, you cover enough boroughs, there's presumably some level of mayoral common sense across the boroughs of London. Presumably you could go back to the mayor's office and go, right, we could do with some consistent advice on where we can do this, and then crowdfund it across the lot of you, rather than just letting Jenny and her tiny co-op foot the bill.
Excellent idea, Charlie.
Not wanting to cause trouble.
Yeah, no, excellent idea. Also, Jenny, you might talk to a local friendly councillor who can actually ask the officer for that particular advice if briefed properly about it, and he will get it for free.
We tried that, and we never heard back from the councillors.
Yeah. I'll take your suggestion on board, Charlie. That's a great one.
So what we did in Greater Manchester 10 years ago, we basically got the combined authority to go to the 10 boroughs and synchronise planning controls.
Brilliant.
Who's Jenny's MP?
Kathleen, you want to come in?
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Charlie. That was really interesting and I learned so much. I was just wondering if you have any experience or could direct me to anyone who has experience of refurbishing and retrofitting.
Your sound went completely pear-shaped there, Kathleen.
It did.
You sounded, you went a bit silent. No. Kill your video and then have another go. Mute your video, leave the sound on, have another go.
Well done.
Go on, have another try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether you have any experience of, or could direct me to people that do, of retrofitting and refurbishing council blocks instead of demolishing them.
Well, down where you are, you're sport for choice, really. I mean, I'd start with the AECB. I would talk to Retrofit Works because they're based in Kennington. And you might get, I mean, they're doing the GLA's stream for fuel poverty. But I'm advising Manchester City Council, who's just reabsorbed its Almo. I'm talking to them about doing a zero carbon retrofit on 28 walk-ups, 4-storey, deck access, built in 1961. And I reckon I can get them to zero for the amount of money they got from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. But you've got SHDF in the way. That's the bit that, but they shouldn't be demolishing the blocks. They should be using SHDF to get them to at least to a C, and that's better than nothing.
Thanks.
Who's next?
Greg or Mark?
Just we had a go at some retrofit in our co-op to try and reduce issues of condensation using internal thermoboarding, which we thought was fairly well sealed. Yeah, you're smiling. You might be.
I'm grimacing, Greg. I'm grimacing.
Well, it was after the double glazing, and we've still got areas of cold bridging and all those things. The thermoboarding didn't solve problems, and it's lots of mold behind them.
Yep. If you could send me photographs of that, Greg, I would like to show those to people that still tell me that thermoboard is a valid retrofitting measure. So if you have got pictures, do please email them up to me.
Well, I'll see what we've kept and what we can find. I think we probably do have, especially where it's an outside wall and someone puts a cupboard up against it.
Yeah.
But any other, it's not the thought of like you're putting your clay backing behind the thermoboard or another way of doing the same sort of thing.
There is a product called SWIP, which are the people that bought the IP off Knauf for their thermoshell system that I used 8 years ago. But they say you don't have to strip the plaster, which means that they must be relying entirely on the vapor control layer. The problem with thermoboard is what you do around the edges, and indeed therefore with this SWIP system as well. So I would always advise stripping the gypsum. If it's lime, you can leave it, but it's almost always got a gypsum skim on top of it anyway. But you're trying to make sure that it's called the critical interface, because as you can imagine, if your heat disappearing out through your wall meant you'd cooled the internal face of the brickwork, and then you actually shoved insulation on the inside of it, it's going to mean that the whole of your brick wall is cold rather than just the outer leaf. And therefore any moisture that manages to get through your wall will then land on that brickwork, condense and then moulder. And obviously if you've got floor joists in that, it'll then rot your building structure as well. And so what you're trying to do is either stop the moisture getting to the wall in the first place, or making sure that if the moisture gets there, it can be dissipated appropriately. So all of the people I work with use a software called WUFI, W-U-F-I, where you test the build-up against that, and you try and make sure that that all the construction at the critical interface can handle the amount of moisture that lands there. But that system that we've put on there, the build-up there is not far off the SWIP system, except that we're using insulated studs made with wood fibre, not something that's going to kill you in a fire. And we've then calculated it properly, so that there's this thing called a vapor control layer that's just behind the. In fact, it's in the bottom left of this picture. Is this up there? No, it's not. Hold on a second. Let's just share that. So there on the left of Carl is the insulation build-up, so that you've got you can see the timber studs behind him. And the insulation stuff between them, and then to his left you've then got the vapor control layer stuffed on top of that, and then some battens to provide a mounting point for the plasterboard. And as you can see, that green stuff is all the tape that makes it airtight. The problem with when people use thermoboard is they tend to just think, well, just stuff it up against the wall, it'll be fine. If you can make sure that there are no air gaps at all, You can make thermoboard work. I've heard of people making it work, but it tends to be beyond the ken of most installers. They just shove it up there like on a dot and dab, and then you've got all of these voids round the dabs of adhesive for it to suck in moisture, because obviously as the temperature changes in a wall, the air expands and contracts, so it can inhale into that space from inside the property. And so you then need to, I don't think I've got the picture here. There's one. So there you can see the vapor control layer is wrapped around into the window reveals, and that's just before taping, so that you can make sure that there are no air gaps. And that's the same when you get to the floor. So if you wanted to just do a real cheap as chips option, then the thermoboard can work, but you've got to make sure that no air from inside the property can get through your new layer. And so at which point you then move to a wood fibre system and you strip the plaster, because then it means that if you do end up with any defects, any failures in the tape, or somebody digs a hole in the wall to put a new socket in, then you've actually got a second layer of protection. Well, that was a techie moment. That was a techie question, Greg. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
You're muted, Mick. Or you've killed your sound because you haven't got.
Sorry, the song got killed there. Mick Gilgan.
Yeah, I think that suggestion Charlie made a while ago, and you were interested, Mick, as well. I think it's probably a job for the executive. If maybe the next meeting, I know it's 14th, you're going to meet. Take on board, joining up forces, amalgamation of the co-ops, just to lobby, just to put the case forward to London Mayor Sadiq or the GLA that we need funding for insulating of our homes.
Well, I don't think that should be. Sorry to interrupt you there, mate,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's the ask. I think the ask is give us access to some borrowing. I think politically you're far likely to get better penetration. As I've shown from the numbers, obviously you've got London prices for the installs, so you might still need a bit of assistance, but you could cover an awful lot of that if you could just get access to PWLB levels of borrowing. Or, the other thing is that when I did the funding research for Retrofit back in 2017, London and Quadrant sold £1 billion worth of bonds. And because it's London, where basically, let's face it, you can put a toilet roll holder up for sale and sell it for quite a lot of money if you get in it. They sold it in 4 tranches of 250 million. They sold some of it at 1.6%, and they sold some of it over 40 years. I can't even begin to understand how a 40-year bond works. But obviously, the London property market is so weird, and you're all in it. That you can, and I believe you can still grant vacant possession theoretically on your properties as a funding proposition. I remember that the Right Honourable Mr. Rogers banging on about that 20 years ago, Jesus. So that there are things you can do there. I think, and obviously for those you will still have and you should have access to SHDF because you're social housing providers. Or how many of you are registered co-ops actually?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
A lot of us.
The ones that aren't registered, you can then just look for Green Homes grant type stuff and treat yourself as private landlords.
Yeah. I think I'll just say, I think it's worth, rather than sort of, I think it was just mentioned in the chat, rather than approaching individual local authorities, I think, it'd be more London-wide if we approach the GLA. And I think, as said in the chat by Wilfred, I think, it's in the Federation's manifesto. So I think worth pursuing, definitely, especially for the smaller co-ops that aren't financially sound.
Yeah.
Right. Any more questions for Charlie? Go ahead, Greg. Over.
I was just saying that this is the sort of thing that we should be bringing up through the London Housing Panel. But it's needing to have a range of input to actually remind you of the different things that's actually going on, because it's easy to focus on your own personal priorities. I don't think we have any of the people that I thought might be asking for loan stock actually here to actually talk about that. Just I mentioned the accounts that we've now got £2,500 of loan stock. We're intending continuing to use any ongoing surplus for that. So as other people might be watching this video, just a reminder that if you've got a viable project with a sound business plan and you're recognisably a community co-op group, then we would look at that in the future.
It's fine. Just a comment on the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. I seem to remember, now Charlie, I might be wrong, that it's actually administered by local authorities, not by the regional authorities.
I don't know,
Because
that's not my end of the market.
But I'll investigate that and maybe send everybody out something about that, because it's worthwhile knowing about it. I think originally it was for local authorities to apply the first wave, and I think they've opened up to social housing. The next waves will open up to all social housing providers, but it's something we need to keep an eye on. I
know that combined authorities do the applications for LAD. And so obviously for those of you that are not registered, LAD funding, getting in on some of the LAD funding that I know will be worth you. Do you know about that?
Word was an individual called John Colmurray, who's an officer down in the GLA, in the Mayor's office, and is a specialist in this.
You can just go to EcoFurb's website. You can even I just misspoke, ignore the first one.
EcoFurb, yeah.
Quietly, so I didn't thump into the keyboard. You could, if you're in London, you can do a free retrofit, but it at least gives you a start.
Plan builder.
It's Parity Projects provides EcoFurb to retrofit works, and the GLA pays both of them for that. Is how that all works. But basically, you've got a line in there, and I can if you want to get your ducks in a row, I can put you in touch with Russell Smith at Parity at Retrofit Works and see if you can, because I'm sure that they would. I'm not sure. I would have assumed that they would be able to help. Certainly, your private.
That would be useful. Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie. You can give us those links. I might also ask you to speak to a few people in the summer from Islington Council, if you're willing to do that.
I've done a presentation to Islington Labour Party.
I remember that one, yes, years ago. That's the Islington Labour Party, which is different. It
was only a couple of years ago. It was only a couple of years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, I remember it. I couldn't make it because I had to go to a council meeting, but I remember that. What's his name? Dave? I know the guy who organised it. Because his surname now, he's since left the party. Whatever.
Sorry, was that Dave Rosenberg?
Come in again?
Yeah. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Dave.
Right. Yeah. Right. Have we covered everything? Does anybody want to have any final questions to Charlie? We're actually finishing on time for a change. It's 11:30, just about. Well, a minute out.